David, how you doing?
Doing good. How are
Dude,
you?
I'm good. Man, since the last time we talked, like so much has happened, right? We were
Yeah.
talking, I think it was earlier this summer, May or June, if I'm not mistaken. And like I was thinking about this as I was kind of preparing for this. Since the last time we've talked, we've had Joe Biden step out of the race. We've had things intensify in Ukraine with more money and arms that we're sending to Ukraine. And they're using those now not as a defensive strategy, but an offensive strategy. The war in the Middle East has turned into a hot war between Iran and Israel, full on, right? No longer using proxies. There's been a presidential candidate who's had two attempts on his life, potentially a third. I mean, that's a lot of news in like a few months. I mean, it's craziness. So I'm just glad you're willing to hop on with me and help me and the listeners kind of try to make sense of all this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
So let's start here with the foreign stuff, right? Has there been any massive developments in what we're doing with Ukraine right now?
Well, of course, there was the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk that took over. I mean, they claim like 500 square miles at one point. I think the Russians have taken at least half of that back, assuming that they actually took that much territory, which I doubt. But the Russians have made tremendous, or rather substantial progress in the Donbass region, which is the primary. That's really kind of what the key territory that the war was fought over in the first place, if there wasn't a territory, because it really wasn't, from Russian President Putin's perspective, it wasn't really a war for territory. It was a war against U.S. imperialism in terms of NATO expansion. And so it could have been easily resolved without war. And Putin was trying to do that for 15 years unsuccessfully. But yeah, the Russians are making a lot of gains, but it's not even the territorial gains, because having studied Russian military doctrine, their focus is not to take territory, but to grind down enemy troops. And according to what I think are accurate estimates, Ukraine has suffered well in excess of 1 million casualties since the war began. Whereas the Russians, I think, are probably around the 250,000 to 300,000 range, of which perhaps I would say 85,000 or have been killed in action. So people talk about, I have a friend that talks about, the war in Ukraine is kind of Russia's Vietnam. I mean, in terms of casualties, I think that's absolutely accurate. I mean, their casualties are a little bit more than what we suffered in 10 years of war in Vietnam. But in terms of what they've been able to do to the Ukrainians, I mean, Ukraine is really bordering on being a failed state, which is, Putin's first or preferred option was to make Ukraine a neutral state at peace, essentially whole and free, other than, I guess, Crimea. But that he actually wanted Ukraine to keep the Donbass region, which is half Russian, ethnic Russian. It's Russian speaking, 75% Russian speaking. But as you mentioned, the key variable here is that the Biden regime keeps crossing Russia's red lines, particularly with regards to Ukrainian missile strikes, consisting of U.S. ATACMS missiles as well as British Storm Shadow and other NATO built missiles, and they're using them for deep strikes into Russian territory, both against military and civilian targets, including nuclear targets. So they're actually attacking. They've been attacking Russian nuclear, and it's not constant, but they've engaged in a number of very disturbing attacks on Russian nuclear bomber bases, Russian nuclear naval bases, missile defense, early warning, radar sites. That if the U.S. If we were to reverse things and have Mexico or Canada doing the same thing to us with Russian or Chinese support, we would have already
Sure.
invaded and conquered them by now. bomb the crap out of them, to say the least, minimally. So it is kind of unnerving. Even more unnerving, I think, is what I see happening with regards to Taiwan over the next 3 months.
So before we move on to Taiwan, because that is something I want to cover as well, what do what do you make of North Korean soldiers being embedded with it seems to be Russian soldiers, or I don't know if they're its own contingent or what's going on, but what's happening there with North Korea and Russia kind of looks like being pretty good friends at this point.
Well, it's just kind of a formalization of an alliance agreement that's been in place since the days of the Soviet Union. I mean, Russia never stopped being, or rather, North Korea never stopped being a Russian ally, a Chinese ally, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. You know, China, of course, has been their principal support in terms of economic assistance, financial, military assistance, military technological assistance, nuclear missile technology. But now Russia has been begun providing that same type of assistance. In terms of military technological assistance, mainly for advanced missile systems, missile propulsion systems, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles. I mean, North Korea already has what I consider to be the fourth most advanced nuclear arsenal on the planet. Probably uh, may not be the fourth largest nuclear power because I think Israel still overmatches them. But they're probably they're without question they're in the range of Britain and France with more advanced delivery systems. They have mobile missiles, mobile ICBM systems. They have a full nuclear triad. They have a nuclear missile submarine, and they have hypersonic missiles. Nuclear hypersonic missiles that we don't have, and multiple different types of ICBMs. We only have one ICBM, and their ICBMs are MIRV, most likely. So, but in terms of what they're doing in Ukraine with Russia, Russia has they signed an formal alliance agreement, as I'm sure you're aware. I think it was earlier this year. Since that time, North Korea, Kim Jong Un has been paying back Russia for all their technology shipments by sending a full division's worth of Korean People's Army troops to Russia for training for deployment in the Kursk region. So I don't expect there to be a lot of North Koreans involved in direct combat with Ukraine. I think it's more they're more playing kind of a defensive role. So to allow Russian troops to redeploy to the primary region, which currently is the Donetsk region, Western Donetsk, and the Donbass region. Could be later. It could be Belarus. It could be Kyiv. If Putin was serious about knocking Ukraine out of the war very quickly, he would either use a super EMP weapon on Kyiv, or else he would reinvade Kyiv from Belarus, or from Chernihiv, which is also borders on Kyiv Oblast. So I think it's significant, but I don't think it's as significant as some U.S. National security experts have stated. Because again, to me, this is just a reiteration of an alliance that's been in place since the fall of the Soviet Union informally.
So with this move of involving North Korea in kind of a defensive posture, if you will, um, do you think that's an outgrowth of the casualties that Russia has suffered so far, or do you see this more as I don't know, just coming to your buddy's aid kind of a thing, right? I mean, do you think that there's an overall strategic advantage to this, or is this simply a show of solidarity?
It's simply a show of solidarity. It's really not much of a force multiplier. I would say that North Korean arms shipments, particularly artillery and munitions in particular, have been much more decisive in helping Russia win the war against Ukraine. The numbers of troops, we're talking about 10 to 11,000. Again, probably not first line, frontline troops, but maybe second line troops. I think it's more symbolic.
Okay.
Um,
So with that said, where do you think, well, you know what, we'll get to that in a minute. Let's move on now to China and Taiwan. What do you see happening there now?
well, they, China recently held the largest air and naval joint blockade exercise that they've ever held. It was from October 14th to 15th, and it was in direct response to a speech given by Taiwanese President William Lai that China was unhappy about because it underscored his continued, um, uh, you know, statements about Taiwanese independence, essentially that Taiwan was a fully sovereign nation, and wasn't going to be subservient to communist China, the People's Republic of China. So China had previously warned before President Lai won the election in January that if the Taiwanese people voted for him, then they would be choosing war. And there's been a lot of different moves since then. Two different blockade exercises, again the largest they've ever had. The most recent was entitled Joint Sword 2024B. The previous one was 2024A. And this one involved about 34 Chinese ships, including 17 naval vessels, PLA Navy vessels, warships, as well as 17 Coast Guard vessels, including 4 different Coast Guard fleets that really demonstrated China's ability, to fully blockade Taiwan's major ports. And and this one didn't involve missile launches. That was all kind of simulated. But in every other way, including 125 aircraft flyovers of Taiwanese airspace, this was really one that I was concerned might be the real thing, because I've been warning for 2.5 years now that when China, blockades Taiwan, they're going to do it under the pretense of an exercise. Then the exercise won't end. And this, for the first time ever, when they announced these exercises, not only was there no prior warning of the exercise, but they didn't announce an end date. So
Mm.
that set off alarm bells in the minds of myself and some of my colleagues on the Committee for the Present Danger of China that I serve with. Many of whom are former retired Navy captains and Army colonels. And thankfully it did end after 24 hours, but we were all kind of left thinking this was the final dress rehearsal. The next time this happens in 3 to 6 months, or maybe a lot less, it's probably going to be the real thing.
Whew. So just to put it in perspective, what does that mean for the United States if Taiwan is taken over by China, right? Because Taiwan produces a lot of chips, correct? And we
Right.
rely on a lot of those chips, from everything from your car to your computer to your cell phone, right? They're like, isn't some upwards of 80%, if I'm not mistaken, that come out of Taiwan?
Well, in terms of advanced semiconductors, it's actually closer to 90%. But in terms of overall semiconductors, it's about 60%. So the advanced superconductors are needed for some of the most advanced cars, computer systems, mobile phones, um, weapon systems. So, yeah, we're not going to easily replace those. All of that stuff, car production, mobile phone production would slow down. The number of 8 to 9% of GDP reduction has been repeated constantly by the neocons. But I think they're, in state talking about that, they're missing the big picture, because, yeah, of course, if we were to lose, if Taiwan were to blow it up, or if China were to blow up those facilities, or if China were to, stop selling them to us, the semiconductors from Taiwan, then yeah, we would take perhaps an 8% GDP hit. But let's imagine if China simply if we went to war with China, because that's really the argument. The neocon argument of, oh, we need to go to war with China over Taiwan to avoid that 8% hit. Well, guess what? If we go to war with them, does anyone really think that they're going to keep trading with us and supplying us with all of our,
Right.
life-saving pharmaceuticals, raw earths, critical components for weapon systems, everything else that we become dependent on them for? Absolutely not. So it wouldn't. If we went to war with them, or if they simply cut off all trade with us in response to a war or massive U.S. economic sanctions, the hit would likely be 15 to 20% of GDP. 8% was the Great Depression. So if we're talking 15 to 20%, we don't have any idea how horrific that would be. I mean, people would the amount of Americans going hungry, homeless, all that stuff would go way up. And so I've proposed a peace proposal that is kind of what I call an EU solution, EU Confederation style solution for the Taiwan issue, and it basically would say, Taiwan and China would sign a unification agreement, but it would be a confederation in which Taiwan maintains its full self rule, but there's kind of a pretense. Not I won't say an illusion, because there would be some basically Taiwan would become an ally of China, so it kind of shift from being a U.S. ally to a Chinese ally, and there'd be like one military base on the most southern reach of Taiwan that's far away from their population. That would be a Chinese naval base. So it'd be mostly symbolic, but I think it would buy Taiwan another perhaps up to 20 more years of self-rule before China started deciding that they wanted to do a full takeover. And that's a lot more time than they're going to get if we could, if at this rate, because I assess that by January they're likely going to blockade and take over Taiwan.
Wow. I I I think that's a practical solution, um, for sure. The one thing I'm always concerned about, especially with those countries that have Marxist slants to them, right? And I do know that China has made some steps in terms of at least state capitalism, right? It doesn't mean you don't have Marxism at home, but you at least understand you have to play in the in capitalism on the international level. But I still believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you know better than I do. Do they still have a Marxist bent to them, China?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's. I mean, China is a totalitarian country. Every Chinese company, that has the pretense of being independent or, non-PLA or PAP owned is in effect, it's just an extension of the Chinese government. Typically, Chinese companies are owned by princelings or other elite members of the Communist Chinese Party. And there's a law that they have to commit espionage whenever asked by the Chinese government. So essentially, every Chinese company in America is operating as a tool of the government, whether it's state owned or not. So I've long differed with the idea that China has gotten a semi-capitalist system. I don't think there's really any evidence of that, and certainly with the latest crackdowns by the Chinese Communist Party. Any pretense of that is being done away with, I think.
So with that said, because like I went through a funny period when I was really searching things out, both from a religious standpoint when I became a Mormon to, how does that affect politics, right? I'm a guy who doesn't believe that politics and religion don't intersect. They absolutely intersect. But my question for you then is, having read the Communist Manifesto, there is a certain level that they understand that what communism ultimately wants, it can only have if everybody buys in, right? If everybody's in the system. And so where we would kind of that peace tree that you were talking about, and I think it absolutely could be strategic in the sense that it buys us more time, but at some point that has to be curtailed, right? We can't let China keep doing that, can we? Because it'll just keep pushing that front farther and farther to the west, right?
Yeah, this would essentially be a one-off, other than the South China Sea, which I think we could find a compromise with. Obviously, we're not going to accept their 10-dash line, but maybe if we split it in half, if China got the western, kind of the southwest China Sea, and then our allies, maintained some degree of control in the southeast China Sea. I think that's a compromise that we could accept, and that I think China would accept. Still wanting to push us, in the east South China Sea, but at least temporarily that would stave off any conflict. But really, China's only nuclear red line that they've talked about has been over Taiwan. So just like if Texas had declared independence, 8 decades ago or whatnot, and we were trying to get it back, and Russia and China were starting to deploy troops there and armed Texas to the teeth, so we couldn't take it back. We wouldn't accept no for an answer. And it's not quite that clear cut. I mean, yes, Taiwan has spent the vast amount of its history as part of China, but it's never been part of the People's Republic of China. And I've been a long time supporter of Taiwan. It wasn't until perhaps 13 years ago that I gave up on the idea that we should be willing to sacrifice the lives of 200 million Americans to defend Taiwanese independence. But I've since wisened up. If I can't be America first and say that we should allow America to be destroyed and annihilated in a nuclear war in a failed attempt to protect Taiwanese independence. Taiwan is unlike Ukraine, the U.S. actually does have legitimate national security interests in Taiwan. We have, a strategic interest. It's not so much as a lot of the neocons will argue that Taiwan has a strategic location because it's right off the Taiwan Straits, through which 60% of international trade travels through. Well, China basically owns the Taiwan Straits, whether they have control of Taiwan or not. So I think that's a foolish argument. The other argument they use is, Taiwan comprises part of the first island chain, and if we give up Taiwan, then they'll break through to the second island chain and beyond. And that's a stupid argument as well. I mean, if you look at a map of the Western Pacific, there's really no geographic barriers that prevent China, with the most powerful navy in the Pacific, from being able to really dominate the entire Western Pacific. So, and that's, one of my colleagues on the Committee for the Present Danger of China is Captain James Fennell. And he served as Director of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which was actually a Rear Admiral position. So he was in a position that was higher than his military rank. But he has stated that the Chinese, the PLA Navy currently dominates the waves all the way out to the second island chain. The second island chain consists of Guam, Marianas, and various other islands out about 1,500 miles away from the Chinese mainland Chinese coastline. So, that being the case, he also said that the Chinese would outnumber the U.S. Navy in warships 10-1 in the South China Sea if we went to war with them over Taiwan. There's really no realistic possibility of the U.S. winning a war with China over Taiwan. So, I'm very confident that if President Trump were to be elected, he would negotiate a deal, hopefully along the lines that I've researched, that I've been calling for over the last year plus, because I think that's kind of the best we could possibly get. But his overriding focus is to avoid World War III. Why does he want to avoid World War III with Russia and China? Because we wouldn't survive. America would not survive as a country. Americans might survive, but the country wouldn't. The country would break apart, wouldn't exist anymore. At best, we'd be a failed state, much worse than Ukraine, probably along the lines of the Gaza Strip, with some kind of central regime, but maybe militia forces and warlords, maybe kind of a Mogadishu, Somalia situation. So we don't want that to dark future to materialize. And there's no reason for us to accept that. I'm about to publish an article kind of about World War II history, but also about what I think our new our national security strategy should be, and it's one that I think should focus on not on strategic clarity as the neocons would have us do and say that we should defend Taiwan militarily, but rather on strategic autonomy and strategic flexibility, where we state, yeah, we'll keep these alliances, all of our existing formal alliances, but they'll kind of be just as conditional as our posture with regards to Taiwan, in that we can say we may react by going to war, we may use nuclear weapons to defend our ally, or if we calculated our interests not to intervene militarily, then we won't do that. And that actually has a beneficial effect, I think, on our allies, because currently our allies, they haven't developed nuclear weapons, they haven't spent sufficient on their defense. Taiwan only spends 2.4% of its GDP on defense. China spends 4%. Other countries like Poland are spending 5%. Israel is spending around 5%. Russia's spending 6 to 7%. The U.S. spends about 3.3%. So, it would enable them to, be less, I guess, more accommodating of our adversaries to avoid war, but at the same time to do more for their own defense. And so, which would lower the risks, I think, for the American people and enhance U.S. security.
So you said a couple things earlier that really stuck out to me. And you said the last time we had an 8%, and forgive me if I misheard you, the last time we had an 8% hit to GDP was the Great Depression. Is that correct?
The only time in modern history we suffered an 8% hit to our GDP or worse was during the Great Depression.
Okay.
That's correct.
And so let me ask you this question. If China, if the plan that you outlined was followed, let's say Trump gets elected, he decides, you know what, this is a good plan, and he was to follow that plan. Do you think China, once they had formed that confederation with Taiwan, that Taiwan could continue to trade with us as far as those chips and that sort of thing to avoid that 8% hit? Or do you think that 8% hit is going to come no matter what, just because of the global instability that causes?
Yeah, so that 8%, that's a great question. The 8% hit would not materialize if my plan were implemented and accepted by China, because they wouldn't control the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing industry. They would have kind of a joint defense council, joint security council, joint technological cooperation, research projects, business collaboration, things of that nature. But a flag that was shared, it wouldn't be the Chinese flag or the Taiwanese flag. It'd be something in between. So that's the thing that people need to realize is we can entirely avoid the 8% hit simply by, number one, negotiating a peaceful solution with China. But we don't even need to do that. We could simply, if after a blockade is initiated, if we had, moderate economic sanctions against China in response to that, harshly worded diplomatic letters, things of that nature. If that was the limit of what we did, China would keep selling those semiconductors after they took it over, assuming again that Taiwan didn't blow it up or the U.S. didn't blow it up, or it didn't get destroyed while China was invading, which that's probably the least likely option or possibility. We don't even have to. If someone is truly concerned about the 8% hit, the loss of Taiwanese semiconductors, they would support peace with China, because that's really the only possibility where we don't get that hit. If we go to war with China, we'll have a guaranteed Great Depression that's much worse than the first. There's no possibility of winning that, so why fight it? It's not if it were China invading the U.S., you fight to the death, right?
Right.
You don't give up, you don't surrender. But this is a country that's half a world away. It's 6,900 miles from the U.S. Pacific coast. It's the size of a little bit larger than Moldova, so it's a very, very tiny island. Very, it's strategic. I wouldn't say it's not so much strategically located, but by virtue of what we talked about with the advanced semiconductor production, um, which is, it's really integral to our economic well-being as a country, as well as that of our allies. Because we've allowed, our semiconductor manufacturer, at least, advanced semiconductor manufacturing uh, to really kind of fade away under the idea that globalism is great and we don't need to build anything. We can just be consumers and, service oriented economy. That's a fight I've been fighting with folks on the other side, the neocons, for 25 to 30 years. And I was you might remember Pat Buchanan, ran for president 3 times.
Yep.
I worked for his campaign in '96, and everything that he warned about has come to pass, tenfold. And thankfully President Trump has kind of picked up the America First mantle, and he's got a plan and a strategy to counter China, but without war. And I think that's really essential.
Okay. So one last question on China here, and then I want to move on. But with that plan, the other thing I see it doing is it buys us time, right? Because just as you were saying, we don't make any of our own crap, right? Our
Right.
pharmaceuticals, our chips, everything, right? People, like, here's the pro, and don't get me wrong, I think I do it, certainly I see my family go there. I'm sure some of your family goes there. We've become too reliant on Walmart to a certain extent, right? All that crap comes from China, right? And the reason that we can afford that when times are tough, like they are now, right? I don't care what the stock market's doing. On the street, it's tough in some sectors. So you fall back to that cheaper quality just to keep clothes on people's backs. If we have to start producing our own things again, right? And this would be one of those things with this plan where I could be like, okay, this buys us time that, what, maybe we start firing up the mills again up in New England. Maybe we start think about, making steel in Pittsburgh again and start producing our own pharmaceuticals and those sorts of things and just really get on a kind of a war footing, for lack of a better term. Not saying we have to go to war, but I always feel like being prepared for that is never a bad thing. I do agree with Reagan that peace through strength is a thing, right? But we're not in a place of peace through strength right now. Not because we don't have a military, but mainly because we're too reliant on everybody else to get our stuff. Does that make sense? Am I off base there anywhere? Am I making it too simple?
No, you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. I mean, minimally, to be able to fight a war against China, we would be able to have to produce our own weapons, without Chinese components, right? And
Right.
that's something we're not doing right now. So, let's say 10 years from now, we do that, and then nuclear weapons magically disappear, and we're kind of on a more even fighting threshold, that would be one thing. The problem is you can't put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. There's
No.
super EMP weapons that our enemies have that we don't, that could take us out without warning. You know, knock down our entire critical infrastructure and make it so we couldn't rebuild. And then they have cyber weapons, which the first day of major combat with China over Taiwan, they would hit us with everything they had in terms of cyber and counter space weapons. The example of I would note is there was a Boeing satellite, communication satellite, that exploded a couple weeks ago, and I think China is likely to blame. I actually raised that question with the director of intelligence for U.S. Space Command, and he said he didn't have any intelligence that indicated that, but I could tell that he might have some idea that
what,
that
what,
that was. He said it was a possibility.
what he
So
said is I don't have any on me right now in this suit. It's in the other pocket on the other suit.
yeah.
Let me ask you this question, and then I want to move on to Israel, and then I want to move on to the elections. Um, when we look do we know for certain that Russia and China have super EMP weapons?
We do, yeah. In fact, interestingly, China just did a test, did an EMP test to ascertain whether their nuclear command and control system was capable of withstanding an EMP blast, and it was successful. So they're clearly. I don't know of another time where they've done that. So they're clearly preparing for nuclear war. Doesn't mean they're planning to do it, but they're getting ready for nuclear war. Meaning that I think they believe they've taken Biden's threat seriously. That when he was asked 5 different times if he would defend Taiwan militarily and go to war with China, he said 4 times. The first 4 times he said yes. It was just the last time he said maybe. And so, China's massive military buildup, they've been mobilizing their military and economy for war for the last 2.5 years, since April of 2022. And they don't have any reason to do that. If their only plan was stop at Taiwan, if they didn't have any intention of fighting the U.S., there's no reason they would need to build up their forces. They already have the largest army in the world, the largest navy, the largest coast guard, the largest nuclear ballistic missile force by far, many times over. And yet they're still expanding their military. And we don't have any accurate reports or estimates of how much they're expanding their military. But I wouldn't be surprised if they had 3 million troops instead of 2.2 million that they had in 2022. I think their military expansion program's that great. And of course, their nuclear missile buildup has been on the order of at least 4%, 400%. So, these are my estimates, by the way. They start out, I think, with 1,000 nukes. I think they're probably building up to around 5,000. I think that buildup will likely be completed by next year. So they've already massively exceeded the size of our nuclear arsenal. Russia, of course, has many times as many nukes as we have that are operational. We're just completely overmatched, So I've never seen the amount of existential threats the U.S. is facing right now. It makes our World War II fight against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan look like Disneyland. There's just no comparison. We were never really threatened. Japan, of course, had the ability to invade Hawaii and some Aleutian Islands, but the U.S. mainland was never threatened by any enemy back then, and none of our enemies had strategic bombers. So that helped. They didn't have atomic weapons like we did. But nuclear wars can be fought and won, and we proved that with Japan. Japan didn't have nukes, but that was a nuclear war, and
Right.
we won it. So there's certainly controversy as to whether two nuclear powers can fight each other and one can win. But Russians have always believed that. Russian political and military leaders have believed that since the 1960s, and I think the Chinese do as well. I actually don't think that there's going to be a massive nuclear war. I think that at most, we would be attacked with perhaps 10 nuclear weapons to take out, 80% of our nuclear arsenal. DC, of course, a lot of our NC3 relay stations, those could be taken out. Nuclear bomber bases, nuclear submarine bases. But I think the main threat is cyber and also super EMP. So, that's what I'm expecting. I think the chance of a massive cyber attack on the U.S. are huge if we get into a hot war with Russia or China. I think, in fact, they're guaranteed. As I mentioned on the first day of major combat with either Russia or China, they take us down. They take down our country, and we would, start killing each other off for the last scraps of food and water as our, food and water distribution system broke down.
And you mentioned cyber, and that's where I wanted to go next before going on to Israel. Since the time you and I have talked last, I've noticed that there was a massive outage in airline computers. Verizon lost any ability to make phone calls or anything else for a full day. And we've also seen certain banks have issues as well. And maybe you can't speak to this, maybe you can. Are those, and the other thing is that all three of those were remarkably quiet in the media, right? There was not a lot of coverage on those. The Verizon one I found fascinating because that affected millions of people, and
Airport closure. Yeah.
there was hardly a word about it. So my question is, are those kind of like in a prize fight? Are those jabs to see what we're going to do? Are they trying to gauge our defenses, or is this really just glitches in our own system?
There's no question in my mind that all of those incidents were foreign state actor cyber attacks. So the thing about cyber warfare is you can have plausible deniability. You can have like kind of outsource essentially
Mhm.
your cyber attacks to kind of a semi-private organization of hackers. Some kind of private hacker army or organization. But that organization is going to be state sponsored, particularly in the case of Russia and China. They both have kind of private actors that they pay uh, cyber um, for cyber attacks. I mean, I talked to Chris Stewart. Actually, he gave a speech that I was at. Pretty small group, but he recently stated just a few months ago that China is cyber attacking us millions of times a day, and I already knew that Russia was attacking us over 1 million times a day. But they're not huge cyber attacks. But they have the ability, and the commanding general of U.S. Cyber Command, I think it was General Nakasone, stated that Russia, China, and one other country that I believe to be North Korea had the ability to take down our critical infrastructure using cyber attacks alone. That would include, of course, again, our food, water distribution system, our grid, electrical power grid, as well as communications, internet, and even early warning GPS satellites. So, that's a tremendous vulnerability that we need to weigh in whenever we're trying to provoke our enemies to attack us with our foolish, national security strategy of liberal hegemony or primacy, as we have with our imperialist expansion in Ukraine. That's something we need to really consider because really at the drop of a hat, Russia, China, or North Korea, even Iran, I think, could take us out with a cyber or super EMP attack, and that we probably could not recover from.
Phew. Okay. All right. Well, that's pleasant. We'll go ahead and move on for that. Let's look at Israel now. That one is, to me, probably the hardest one to follow because there seems to be so many moving parts and pieces, right? With Ukraine, it's pretty well, I don't want to say isolated who the players are, but you know who they are really quickly. The same with Russia. I mean, same with China and the United States and Taiwan. The one in the Middle East is the one that I find has the most moving parts and pieces to it. And maybe that's just because I'm slow and it's hard for me to wrap my mind around all this. But you got Hamas, you got Hezbollah, you got Iran, and Israel's making incursions into Lebanon. What how do we make sense of what's going on over there?
Well, I think that the most important thing to realize is this has always been a proxy war between Israel and Iran. So for example, when Hamas hit Israel with rocket 5,000 rockets and you know uh, kind of terrorist incursions that killed nearly 1,200 civilians in one day on Israel's side, that was greenlighted by Iran. And Israel had the intelligence. They had every reason to know that was coming. And yet it seemed as if there was maybe a stand down order by Netanyahu. I strongly suspect. I didn't want to believe this at first, but I think Netanyahu wanted this war. He knew that he was, on the ropes politically, and that if he is removed as prime minister, he's likely going to prison, as I fear that Trump is as well for nothing. Trump wasn't corrupt, but Netanyahu was genuinely corrupt, and he likely deserves to go to prison. But Netanyahu has this vision of Israel, which I guess, for lack of a better term, I would call Greater Israel. In Greater Israel, but what I mean by that is that he wants to see Israel expanded to from the river to the sea, and from the river to the sea is something we hear on the Hamas side nowadays. Mm-hmm. But that was actually they got that saying from Israelis, from Zionists. I'm not one to believe in any Zionist conspiracies or the Jews control anything or the Jews are bad. I think the Jews are great. I think that I support the state of Israel in concept. I think that I absolutely support their right of self-defense. But I don't, and I believe that they were justified in striking back at Gaza, at Hamas. But I didn't support the invasion. I would have supported if it was a 3-week invasion instead of a year to multi-year, probably indefinite. I don't think they're ever going to pull out their troops from Gaza. I think they're trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza of the Palestinians so that Israel can fully annex it. But basically, so Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, they all are, and not only that, a bunch of Iraqi militia forces that are integrated in the Iraqi armed forces. All those groups are Iranian proxies. They're armed, they're financed, armed, and allied with Iran. So, Netanyahu talks about fighting a multi-front war. For some reason, he claims that Israel's fighting a 7-front war. He likes to say there must be 7 different Iranian proxy groups. But really, it's just one war. It's kind of one consolidated war against Iranian proxies. And he's been taking a lot of risks, because my concern has not just been for peace in general or even for the Gazans, who I've really tried to champion in terms of Gazan civilians. Israel, of course, has killed 29,000 Gazan women and children, innocent non-combatants. I think that's unchristian. Obviously, they're not Christians, but they at least share a biblical perspective. And, of course, we've done the same thing in the past. We did it far more brutally, the Germans and the Japanese, and we killed, millions, 2.6 million Germans and Japanese civilians with a daily death rate that was, I think, 173 times higher than what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine. And we call Putin a war criminal for that. But we don't call Netanyahu a war criminal for doing even worse to the Gazans. But I've been very concerned about this, all these escalations by Netanyahu in terms of invading southern Lebanon for the first time in nearly 2 decades, risking all-out war with Iran, with missile strikes against their missile production capabilities and nuclear air defense radars. This could really ratchet up to a full-scale regional war. And if it does, it's like if it's a constant shooting war between Iran and Israel, I think there's every reason to believe that Iran already has nuclear missiles. They have had them for several years, and they could obliterate Israel. They could, if they put nuclear weapons on hypersonic missiles, Israel can shoot them down. Back on October 1st, when Iran launched 180 ballistic and hypersonic missiles at Israel, we recently found out that Israel could only shoot down 50%. Last time Iran, shot out some of their slowest missiles because it was more of a symbolic gesture. They launched, 280 missiles, and nearly all 92% were shot down. The rest hit Israeli military bases, but this time 50%. So 90 Iranian missiles hit their targets in Israel, and they were, again, military installations. But if even a few of those were armed with nuclear weapons, then Israel could lose a massive amount of its population. So these are very dangerous games that the U.S. and Israel are playing right now. Britain, of course, and all of NATO, I guess. And we need to really ratchet it down and try to give peace a chance. And I think Trump would do that. absolutely would do that with Russia and China. With Israel, it might be a little slower because he's got kind of more. He's not quite as peace focused, I think, in Israel, but he still has pointed out to Netanyahu that he's kind of screwing the pooch in terms of Israel's international reputation. So I found those comments to be helpful.
Now, and to further kind of complicate the issue, Russia and Iran have a pretty close pact as well, correct? Where Russia has some pipelines in the work, I think, with Iran, if I'm not mistaken, where they're going to be doing some stuff with oil there. How does this war between Iran and Israel, does it have the potential of drawing Russia into that too?
It definitely does. Yeah, I mean, I think again, I think uh, the Middle Eastern war is probably the regional war that I find the least likely to escalate to like a world war.
Okay.
So I will say that I think the chances are low, but absolutely there is a chance that could escalate. For example, if the U.S. or Israel, the U.S. in particular, were to attack Iran's nuclear sites or even their oil sites, that's been expressed as an Iranian red line that could potentially activate, Chinese or Russian military retaliation directly against the U.S. So I think my gut tells me that if we don't cross that line, if we don't engage in direct attacks on Iran, and Israel restrains itself to not do anything worse than it just did, so that they have the same kind of limitation, then I think it probably won't escalate to world war.
Okay. All right. Because it's always the little ones that I find, like it's the Archduke Ferdinand moment that always, destabilizes everything. It's like the most obscure crap that ends up, throwing everything into chaos.
Yep.
Let's switch gears here now because we've just talked about a lot of stuff. I mean, we didn't even really touch economy. I mean, we kind of did, but not really. There's a whole bunch of stuff. But just because your emphasis is kind of on foreign policy and that sort of thing, take me through all three of the kind of the issues we just talked about: Ukraine and Russia, Taiwan and China, and Iran and Iraq. Excuse me, Iran and Israel. I want to look at, okay, what happens if Kamala's elected versus what happens if Trump's elected to all three of those scenarios. Because I think that like the economy is huge to me. I nerded out on it in 2008 because it was really hard on anybody involved in any sort of development. So I'm keenly aware of those things. I'm also keenly aware that that's usually a good time for a dictator to step up, is when people are hungry and scared. But having said that, there seems like the whole globe is kind of on fire at the moment. So I feel like that's where we need to focus at here real quick. So what does all these skirmishes, all these conflicts look like under a Harris Waltz presidency?
Well, as I wrote in my last article that I published, I think last weekend on the Real War newsletter, which is at dpyne.substack.com, World War III really is on the ballot in this election. I've never really said that before. It's never been. This is an existential. We have all these talks about existential war for Ukraine, existential war for Israel. Neither of those are actually true, except to the extent that they provoke their enemies to nuke them. But in the case of this election, it's a question of whether we survive as a nation or not. I mean, it's really that simple. If Kamala Harris was asked, what are some of the things that you've disagreed with on Biden, with Biden that you would have done differently, and she said, I can't think of a single thing. So that it demonstrates a couple things. Number one, it seems to demonstrate that she can't think for herself. It's not that she can't think on her feet; it's that she can't think independently at all. I think Biden has implemented, a very extreme liberal agenda that's been anti-American, arguably, and so Kamala would continue that. But it's one thing to pursue an anti-American agenda that crushes freedom at home, authoritarian and whatnot, but to pursue a foreign policy that actually invites our enemies to ally together and to plan joint attacks on the U.S. that are catastrophic in nature, with nuclear, super EMP, and cyber weapons, perhaps even biological weapons like anthrax. We can't survive that. I mean, the Civil War was the closest we came, I guess, to a fight for our survival. It would be far worse than that. When I talk about that type of warfare, those types of attack on the U.S., I'm talking about the Holocaust. I'm talking about the Holocaust magnified, many times over, because it wouldn't just be 6 million citizens. It could be 250 million citizens. It could be 255 million citizens, according to my upper estimates. 90% of American citizens could be dead within a year following a super EMP attack. If it was a cyber attack, it might be 70 to 80%, assuming the cyber attack wasn't lifted or, otherwise, overcome. So, this is an election. This is an all hands on deck, 5-alarm fire moment where if the American people don't wake up and get out to vote for the candidate supporting peace, we won't have a country. I really honestly can say I don't believe we'll have a country in 4 years. I don't think we'd even have one in 1 year of it following a Harris administration.
True. Okay. So, do you see everything going much different under a Trump win? Right? Do you think he can pull off peace at this level?
So I think the deep state is going all out to try to take him down. If they can't do so with defeating him in the election, they're definitely going to imprison him. They might even try to assassinate him as president-elect. I think that there's a very good risk that he never gets inaugurated for that reason. Obviously, if he'd be inaugurated in prison, but if I think there's a chance they try to take him out. And, they've obviously demonstrated a desire to do that, in terms of the deep state. I think his Secret Service detail was penetrated and compromised during the first assassination attempt. I think Biden kind of, someone high up in the Biden regime, I won't put fingers on who, but someone high up in the Biden regime basically gave a wink and the nod to the assassination. They were aware of that. I'm pretty confident about that. So if they're willing to kill him for wanting peace, and I really think that this is the key issue. President Trump, he's been attacked as an isolationist. He's not an isolationist. He's the so-called isolationists during the World War II period that I'm about to write about, hopefully later this week. They were kind of regional hegemonists. They supported U.S. hegemony in 2 continents, North and South America, and then supported imperialism in the Pacific as well. But they didn't want to, have to fight an unnecessary world war, either in the First or Second World War. And that's kind of, I view Trump as much the same mentality. He wants to keep a lot of our alliances intact, but he doesn't want to feel constrained to fight a nuclear war that's not in the U.S. interest. And, honestly, I don't think there's any nuclear war would be in the U.S. interest to fight unless it involved nuclear strikes on the U.S. itself. So, arguably, if Russia or China allied or took over Canada or Mexico, maybe that would be a reason to fight a nuclear war as well. But these are really dangerous and perilous times. I think Trump really would. I think he would resolve the Ukraine war very quickly. I think Putin would. Putin's been striving for peace really just nonstop. I mean, obviously he's to blame for invading Ukraine after 15 years of failed peace attempts. But he's been trying to end the war since the day after the war began. And initially without any Russian continued Russian military presence in pre-war Ukrainian territory. So that's really a fairly easy war to resolve, and I've written extensively on my website about how to do that. It would essentially involve neutrality, either neutrality for Ukraine or simply a pledge of no NATO membership, with no NATO military presence ever allowed in Ukraine. I actually think that the Russians would accept that. I think they could give up their demand for Ukrainian neutrality and, allow Ukraine to remain a U.S. military ally, as long as we gave up the NATO and, all the troops and the bases and whatnot, shut off most of our weapons shipments. And if Ukraine was demilitarized and ceded, basically recognized continued Russian control of the four annexed oblasts, I think that's an agreement that Russia could live with. I think it's something the U.S. could live with. I even think the Ukrainians could live with that, because they would retain, probably 81% of their internationally recognized territory as secure and independent, with really no real threat of future Russian aggression. So I think that's an easy one. That's probably the easiest one to solve. I think, again, I think that Trump would, in the event that China actually did blockade Taiwan, I think he would not, he would send, our fleet to kind of, show strength. But I don't think he would engage. I think he would try to use that, an increased U.S. military presence in the Western Pacific as the basis for negotiating a deal. And he's really good at that. And he's laser focused on avoiding World War III. He wants peace and prosperity. That's something that most U.S. presidents, before Biden, actually supported. And, so Trump would be kind of in line with that, more of a Reagan peace through strength policy than the Biden war through weakness policy. So I think he could steer us away from war in both with Russia and China. And in terms of Iran, I think, that's the Israel conflict is a little bit slower to resolve. I think there's really not that much, distance or difference, I guess, between Harris and Trump on that issue. I think Harris does want a peace deal to end the war in Gaza, but she's wants to keep supporting Israel. I think Trump's the same way. Trump could probably get it done faster, because I think he's smarter about that and really wants peace in the Middle East as well. But the most important thing he's done to show that he's going to stick to his America First principles this time around is that he picked J.D. Vance as his vice president. So he doesn't have kind of the devil whispering in his ear like he did with Mike Pence. I used to like Mike Pence, but I really really hate Pence now. He's attacked America First conservatives as apologists for Putin and all that, but he just turned out to be a really bad guy. And I don't say that morally, because I still think he's a good guy, morally, like Mitt Romney. But in terms of his policies, they're just disastrous. I mean, he's like a Biden, right there with Biden in terms of his foreign policy being so bad.
Gotcha.
And of course, Romney's the same way. But now he has J.D. Vance, and J.D. Vance is going to reinforce every good instinct that he's ever had on foreign policy and national security policy. And if they can reinforce that by appointing cabinet officials that are America First as well, then it's going to really create the great possibility of peace and an enduring America that we simply won't have under a Harris administration.
Okay. Two more things, and I'll let you go. You said here just a minute ago that you were certain that there was some infiltration into the Secret Service. What leads you to believe that?
If you look at some of the reports that especially Josh Hawley has been publishing, on Twitter and otherwise, and the interviews that he's done, he's exposed layers and layers of critical failures by the Secret Service, and they can't be explained by just incompetence. We know that the current acting director of the Secret Service denied multiple requests from the Trump administration to reinforce the Secret Service security protection detail. We know that the acting or the agent in charge of his detail basically made it a low security event. She allowed people to come in. The Secret Service did not even check for IDs. Obviously, the shooter went through a metal detector with a rangefinder,
Right.
and they talked to him about it, but apparently he went through anyway. Somehow he either made it through that detector or he repositioned himself on the rooftop. Um, I just don't even remember how many there were, but it was they had one of the biggest things was they had Homeland Security agents that had never done protection detail before, and who'd only had like an hour of a Zoom video training on how to protect, not just a president, but anyone, any U.S. government official, and that was all the only experience they had. So I mean, they were doing some stupid stuff. I mean, there were some really great agents, that were shielding the president. Um, the line agents, I'm not going to take anything away from them except to say that some of them were very experienced. Some of them weren't. Most of them were not Secret Service. They were Department of Homeland Security that had spent their entire careers doing something totally different. But yet they still, lined up around Trump to try to defend him and put their bodies, between them and the president. So I have nothing but praise for them. But yeah, there's just, how did the shooter get up there? They refused any, the request of help from the police for like drones. They refused to show up to the meeting. There was a morning meeting for every single presidential protection detail has a morning meeting that's at the site to say, okay, this is our coordination, this is our common security, common communications channel. This is this is how we're going to prevent bad guys from coming in. They didn't even show up. The Secret Service did not even show up to that. They did not even have a common channel, a radio channel to share information about. I mean, the Secret Service agents, or I don't know if it was the police, the Secret Service agent, they had resort to like texts, sending texts, pictures, emails. And then the Secret Service is saying, well, we never got the email. I'm like, are you kidding me? They couldn't have just like one station or a phone number. Like they didn't even have the phone number of whoever, I guess the agent in charge didn't bother to share the phone number with for the local police agency so they could at least call the person in charge with the local, the local police policeman on site to try to share any intel they had about bad actors. So I mean that's just what I remember off the top of my head. But there's no way you can explain that by negligence. It was minimally a very purposeful initiative by the Secret Service, and we know it wasn't the Secret Service that did that. It was the Biden administration to maximize the chances that Trump would be assassinated if an assassin wanted to do that. So while I can't put my finger on and say do we know for a fact that they coordinated with the shooter, or do they simply know about the shooter was going to show up, so they minimized security to maximize his chances of shooting the president? It's hard. We don't know for sure, but it's regardless. There's at minimum there's a desire for in the part of the president and the attorney general that they want Trump dead. Whether they're taking affirmative steps to do that, or they're simply aware of multiple assassination teams that aren't, administration supported, hunting him down, and they're just going to try to make him vulnerable. We don't know the answer to that.
You know, as a surveyor, I understand line of sight real well, right? Because that's how we strategically set up our instruments to be able to take measurements. And I jumped on Google Earth a couple days after, and I was like, okay, I just want to see the lay of the land, right? And like I looked at where that shooter was perched, and I'm like, that's where Secret Service should have been, right? Now I know that it had a really, really super steep, and by steep I mean pretty close to flat roof.
Yeah, it
So
was
I mean,
pretty.
there was danger, not really, to be there, right? And I just started lining everything up, right? And I'm like, I look, I'm no security expert, right? I've never been in the military. I've never been a police officer. I don't understand that. But in just looking around, even a boob like me would have been like, yeah, we want some dudes on that building, right? Because he's going to be able to see the entire crowd. He can see behind Trump, right? And not just, it just made no sense. And so as I looked at all that, and you reiterated some of the things that I had seen and read and heard about, I was like, well, unless you put Cheech and Chong on their worst day in charge of Secret Service, this makes no sense that it could just be inept type of stuff. So, and it kind of confirms what I'm most worried about, right? Is just can we just keep him alive long enough? Because look, him dead, even if you do not like Trump, him being dead does not help you. I know it may seem like it, but it does not help you. Uh, you know, and I'm not saying let me be careful how I say this. I don't want to see civil war at all. But if that bullet had been a couple centimeters in a direction, I think we could have been seeing massive civil unrest. Now, having said that, I want to stay with that topic and wrap up with this. What do you think the fallout is at home here in the United States socially with the Trump victory? What does that look like? Is there any chatter at all? I mean, look, you hang in those circles. What does it look like on the streets if Trump's elected on election night?
It's going to be bad. We know from last time around 2020 that there were all these warnings that if Trump pulled out a re-election victory, that the Antifa and the Black Lives Matter and other domestic leftist extremists would take to the streets, burn down our cities, assault the Capitol like they did. They assaulted the White House. They staged an insurrection against the president and the White House on May 30th, 2022. A lot of people don't realize that was much more of an insurrection than the riot on January 6th on the right side. They were actually trying to lynch the president. They breached the first White House barrier, and the Secret Service ordered the lights turned off. So they deployed Secret Service snipers to shoot anyone who penetrated the final security barrier, and they rushed the first family down to the basement. So in this situation, Biden isn't. He's the president now, so it's going to be a little bit in reverse, but. Jamie Raskin I just watched a video of his comments that a friend of mine sent me, and he's basically saying if that's fine if the American people vote for Trump, he's democratically reelected. We won't let him become president. We're going to do the exact same thing that we accused the Republicans of doing, which is to not ratify his election on January 6th. And then we'll, pull every trick out of the book. He didn't mention that he used the army to shoot conservative Trump supporters, like the president authorized apparently with this latest executive order, document that was released. But we're going to do whatever is necessary to keep him from being inaugurated. So does that extend to shooting him? Does it extend to shooting his supporters? Does that extend to using the army to put down any peaceful protests in the Capitol? I would say likely yes. But I think actually that's not the most likely outcome we're facing. As I wrote in my last article in the Real War newsletter, again at dpyne.substack.com, I'm anticipating the exact reverse. I think Kamala Harris is going to, the Democrats are going to steal the election for Harris. I think it's going to be razor close. I think it's going to be kind of a Bush-Gore race where it's, in that race, it was the difference was like 3 or 4 electoral votes. In this case, I'm predicting it will be I think Kamala will end up with 270 to 277 electoral votes. President Trump would be 261 to 268. Of course, if it's 270, 268, and there's one faithless, Harris elector, then it goes to it's a tie vote. Well, it wouldn't be a tie. It would be 269, 268. But because neither candidate got 270, it go to the House of Representatives, and we know that they would elect Trump. So that's kind of like the scenario that I'm most concerned about is either if it goes to the House and Trump is elected, I think liberals they'll go nuts and burn our cities down. I think if it's the opposite, if it's stolen by a whisker, by Harris, when all the polls show Trump essentially guaranteed to win, if the polls didn't change, all the indicators are in Trump's direction. If the election were free and fair, he'd be assured of an electoral vote landslide. Then I think the chances of conservatives burning down the cities are very low. But could there be another riot in the Capitol? I think likely yes. I think there are a lot of patriots would come, especially as I predicted in a previous interview just last week. I think the chances of Trump going to prison on November 18th, whether he wins or loses, are nearly 100%. I think that they're going to send him to Rikers Island prison. That's a prison that's known for, I think they had 38 murders last year alone. So they could, potentially take Trump out in the prison. But even if they didn't take him out, just having him in prison, would be something that wouldn't sit well with Trump supporters. And again, I don't think there'd be a lot of violence on the Trump supporter side. But I think that what would more likely happen is there might be another Capitol riot, and then Biden has essentially authorized the use of lethal force by the military to kill Trump supporters if he deems necessary. And then once you have our own people, Americans being shot by the National Guard or the U.S. military on orders of President Biden, that's when things get scary. I think if Trump gets shot, if he goes to prison, he gets killed in prison, or he gets assassinated, there's certainly a risk of violence. But particularly if the patriots get shot, that's when I think it could go to, not to civil war, but to severe civil disorder that we haven't seen probably since the Civil War.
Oh, that's a spooky scenario. Holy cow. I said for a long time that we on the right cannot afford to be baited into doing something stupid, right? And I think this is the time that, and I said that when I was a young man, right? That which was unusual because I was usually a hothead as a young kid. But even I understood that this isn't what you want, right? And I think I can't stress enough that no matter how this shakes out, we have got to not be violent because they're just looking for an excuse, right?
Absolutely. That's what they want.
Do not give them the excuse. No matter what happens, do not give them the excuse. Because once they have the excuse, they will start looking for far smaller things to drag people into courts for, right? A tweet, a Facebook post, a picture of you hunting with your buddy. Do not get violent, please. And boy, the other thing, please pray for our country. Get on your knees and pray for our country at this moment. I'm not, I usually try not to be given to hyperbole, but it feels like right now, not just America, but the entire globe is hurtling towards an event. And just like underbrush that is dry, that just takes one spark, I feel like we're right there. And we've got to be peaceful, and but yet firm in our resolution for right, but man, we need to get on our knees and we need to petition the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to just preserve us. Because quite frankly, I don't see another way out of this. Um, we've talked about a lot of gloom and doom things. Last question for you here, David. What kind of hope do you have? I mean, what keeps you hopeful? Keeps you going?
Well, first of all, I just want to underscore your point is if there's one thing that people can take away that your viewers can take away is that you and I and every conservative worth listening to is calling for peace. We're calling for peace, tranquility. People want to have protests. Just be on the lookout. Avoid any acts of violence. Don't mess with the police. Don't get in their faces. Don't yell in their faces. Don't follow the playbook of the left, because the left, they have their allies in power right now. They will get off scot-free no matter if they murder a policeman or not. That won't be the case with patriots. Just merely entering the Capitol and taking pictures, we know that's a potential prison term. So we know that it's exactly what you say. I think the Biden regime, probably Harris to some extent as well, they want us to react to that. They want to have a Reichstag fire because they want to have a pretext to set up their, declare martial law and set up their one-party fascist or Marxist police state, in which there won't be another election. That's the irony is they're calling for. They're accusing Trump of everything they're doing. So they say Trump is a mortal threat to a democracy, trying to stamp out democracy. That's exactly what they've been doing this whole time. So we have to turn back to Christ. We have to, if we repent as a country and do His will, 1 Corinthians, I think can't remember the verse, 1 Corinthians, I think 7:15 or something like that, says that if my people repent and turn back to me, I will heal their land. And so that's the promise. That's really the hope, is that, as Americans see the world on fire and see the country about to collapse around them, and struggles to increase, economically and whatnot, perhaps with a cyber attack, that's when we need to repent. And the Lord has, I think He's removed his protecting arm over the United States. But if we were to repent, that would change. He could protect us. And even if our country doesn't repent, we as individuals and families can repent. We can turn back to God, and the more strictly obedient we are to God's commandments and the Holy Bible, then the greater protection we have for our family. And it's physical protection, it's spiritual protection. But in terms of hope, I mean, President Trump, the Savior is my biggest hope, of course, turning back to God for our country. But my second greatest hope is Trump. I don't think he could, his election, I don't think it would save our country, but he is the hope. He's really our only hope of saving our country in the short term. We all know the second coming is getting close. I think it's probably less than a decade away. So we're living on borrowed time as it is, but we don't want Judgment Day for our country to happen tomorrow or even in January. We'd like it to be a few years away, maybe several years away, to give us more time to prepare and to repent, and prepare for the Savior's glorious return. When He brings an end to all nations and reestablishes peace on earth to rule and reign on earth forever. So that's my hope.
Good stuff. Okay, your Substack, where can people find that?
So it's at dpyne.substack.com. Once again, dpyne.substack.com.
Perfect. Well, David, it's always good to do this with you. I enjoy your insight. Boy, let's talk again just after the new year to see how things went.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I'm always available to talk before then if you want to do an after action kind of review after the election as well.
Dude, let's do that too. I think that'd be awesome.
Okay, sounds
Good
great.
enough. It's good talking to you, David. I appreciate it.
You too. Take care, Dave.
All right. Bye, everybody.